As you undoubtedly know, the RMC picnic is coming up, and part of that tradition is the words that the Hill, Valley, Midlands, and Trail crew choose for the charades. It's hard to imagine, perhaps, but some of the words that have been chosen in the past seem to me at least quite modern. I know this because in our cabin, built in 1903, a Mrs. Krumke, she must have been a summer guest, kept a list of the words for the charades of 1908, which I found in an old notebook. She described in vivid detail how the syllables were acted out, and I thought it might be of interest if I shared some of the words from that distant era. So here they are. The Hill's word was gluten-free. I had no idea this concept was even around in 1908, but there it was. The first syllable was glue. It was pretty graphic. Apparently, there was a glue factory up near West Mile, and someone managed to get hold of a newly severed horse's hoof. They used to make glue out of horse's hoofs, apparently. According to Mrs. Krumke, the hoof was quite gory, dripping blood, and that several veins were evident. The hoof was thrown into a cauldron over a blazing fire and stirred, and then a group of dissolute teenagers appeared and all knelt over the cauldron and began sniffing the glue, and then got up and sort of stumbled around. Very odd for 1908. The second syllable was 10, and this also seemed very incongruous, but I suppose we have to believe Mrs. Krumke. It was a beauty contest, and several women strutted across the stage in skimpy bathing suits, and a group of what she described as dirty old men rated the contestants with placards numbering 1 through 9, not wanting to actually have the number 10 used to give away the syllable. This would never fly today. The final syllable was 3, and this featured a woman dressed like a bird. Mrs. Krumke said she had copious feathers. And she was in a large cage in what was supposed to be a pet store. A young man came into the store and felt very sorry for the bird, and after bargaining with the owner, forked over money for the bird's release, so the bird could be free. The young man opened the enclosure, and the woman ran out of the cage, madly flapping her wings and attempting to fly. And Mrs. Krumke noted that she actually seemed to be gaining altitude, but ended up crashing into Mossy Brook. Mrs. Krumke said it was not a soft landing, it was rather disturbing. The whole word gluten-free was a restaurant set up with tables and chairs and lots of customers. A waiter appeared shouting in a disdainful, thick French accent, carrying huge baguettes, and began ripping them into pieces and throwing them rather violently onto the various tables. An old man began yelling that he couldn't even be near any wheat because he already had a wheat belly. There was a huge food fight with all and sundry throwing chunks of bread at each other. In fact, Mrs. Krumke noted that it got a little out of hand, and 2 men got into a rather violent altercation, which was confusing because it's not part of the word at all. All very odd. She then described the Midlands word, which was climate change, which I didn't even know was a thing in 1908. The first and second syllable was acted out by a group of hikers heading out to climb Mount Adams, equipped with baseball bats, and mitts, which they kept thumping with their fists, ergo, climb mitts, for climate, quote figure. The climb appeared very arduous as the group drudged around in a large circle for what Mrs. Krumke described as an inordinate amount of time, and then when they reached the summit, they were much too tired to play ball, but all collapsed on top of each other in a huge writhing heap. Weird. The change syllable was extremely odd and kind of disgusting, and it's something that I can't imagine occurring today, and I'm even reluctant to talk about it, but I'm just the humble reporter of Mrs. Krumke. In any event, a huge bearded man appeared, wearing nothing but a large, rather grubby diaper, and an old woman came up behind him and quickly pulled the diaper off. Mrs. Krumke said that several gallons of chocolate pudding had been made and applied to the inside of the diaper. Gross. But maybe in 1908 this sort of thing was okay, and it did depict the word change rather effectively. The whole word climate change featured a group of very old Randolphians at a nudist colony who were all totally naked, walking about complaining loudly about the terrible hot weather, and that nudism was the only way to deal with it. Again, this just would not happen today, but it was a different time. What can I tell you? The Valley's word was bucket list. which was amazing. Because this really does seem a very recent term, but again, we have, I suppose, to believe Mrs. Krumke. The whole word was acted on in one scene, and it featured a man asleep and snoring loudly in a big chair. A woman entered with a leather riding crop and began violently swatting the chair very near the man's head. The man woke up with a start, and the woman asked if he had done his chores. The man, rather pleased with himself, pulled out a round piece of wood on which he had written, "To it," T-U-I-T. And waving it in the woman's face, he announced that he didn't need to do any chores because he had gotten around to it. The woman was not amused and pointed to a pail next to the chair and demanded that he find his duties on a scrap of paper in it. The man seemed rather flummoxed and said that he thought that the pail only enumerated the things he was going to try to do before he died. The woman was really confused and upset by this and grabbed the round to it out of the man's hands and bonked it rather sharply on his head and announced that if he didn't get around to it pronto, that she would give him a round to it that he would not soon forget. I cannot imagine this sort of domestic violence happening in charades these days. Don't forget, this was 1908. Sadly, the trail crew was not a mention. Now, I wonder if the words we choose this year will seem as modern and with it as those words from 115 years ago. Hard to say. But so interesting, is it not, to get a glimpse into the charades from ages past. By the way, if anyone needs a diaper wearer in a skit this year, I'd be glad to volunteer. But just to be clear, I am not providing any chocolate pudding. Thank you.